There was a man once who thought he knew the solid ground beneath his feet. He believed in handshakes, in a man's word, in the kind of slow, honest growth that comes from years of sweat equity. He put his faith in bricks and mortar, in the hum of machinery, but most of all in people. He learned, like some of us do, that the ground beneath you can crack, not from an earthquake, but from the quiet, insidious erosion of trust. He learned that what you thought was bedrock could turn to quicksand, and sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from your enemies, but from those you call kin. But he also learned something else, something harder one, that even when the earth swallows everything you've built, a man can still stand on his own 2 feet, and if he's got nothing left but his grit and the calluses on his palms, well, sometimes that's enough to start all over again. Meet Eugene. 48 years old, pushing metal and pushing limits on the assembly line down at the old Northwood plant. His name, you wouldn't forget it, but his face. It was the kind you saw 1,000 times, blending into the backdrop of early morning coffee shops and worn-out lunch counters. But if you looked closer, if you really paused and let your eyes settle on him for a second longer than politeness usually allowed, you'd see a story etched into every line and shadow. He wasn't a tall man, not by a long shot, but he carried himself with a solidity that made him seem bigger, like a sturdy oak in a field of saplings. His work uniform, the standard-issue blue coveralls, always looked a little too clean, a testament to a meticulousness that ran deeper than just keeping tidy. It was a precision born of necessity, of knowing that every detail counted, every bolt, every weld, every moment. His hair, what was left of it, was a salt and pepper stubble that clung close to his scalp, making his forehead seem higher, wider, a canvas for the worry lines that crisscrossed it like faded maps. His nose, a touch crooked, suggested an old fight or maybe just a clumsy tumble in childhood. But it was his eyes that truly held you. They were a muted blue, the color of a winter sky just before the snow falls, and they were set deep beneath heavy brows that almost always seemed to be furrowed in thought. They held a quiet watchfulness, an almost unnerving ability to take in everything without giving much away. You felt like those eyes had seen things, good and bad, and had processed it all, filing it away for future reference. There was a tiredness there, yes, a weariness that went beyond the physical demands of the factory floor, a ghost of an exhaustion that settled deep into the soul. But beneath that fatigue, flickering like a stubborn pilot light in a drafty room, was that undeniable spark of resilience. It was a defiance, a silent declaration that while life might have knocked him down, it hadn't managed to extinguish him entirely. Not yet, not ever. His hands, though, they were the true giveaway. Thick-knuckled and scarred, the skin perpetually stained with grease and tiny nicks, they were the hands of a man who'd earned every penny he'd ever held. They were strong, capable hands, the kind that could fix almost anything, that knew the feel of metal, the weight of a hammer, the delicate touch required for precise adjustments. They moved with an economy of motion, never wasted, each gesture deliberate, efficient. He often rubbed his thumb over the pad of his index finger, an unconscious habit that spoke of constant handling, of feeling the texture of materials, of work that demanded both strength and sensitivity. You could tell just by looking at those hands that Eugene wasn't one for idle chatter. He spoke with his actions, with the silent, steadfast effort he poured into everything he did. He was a man who understood the language of machinery, the quiet integrity of a well-made part, and the profound, unspoken promise of honest labor. He was the kind of man you'd trust to build you a bridge, knowing it would stand for generations. And perhaps that was part of the problem. There was a man once who learned the hard way that not all hands are as honest as your own. He thought he knew the measure of a soul by the promises whispered across a workshop, by the sweat shared on a common job, only to discover that some will gladly watch your world burn, so long as they can pocket a single ember. Eugene, at 48, had years of factory grit etched into his skin, a map of countless shifts and silent observations. He was the quiet sort, Eugene, rarely speaking unless asked, his words as carefully measured as the parts he machined. Yet, his tired eyes missed nothing, holding a spark of stubborn resilience and a surprisingly dry wit for those patient enough to earn it. His initial gruffness, a kind of protective shell, hinted at depths of loyalty and a fierce protectiveness for what he truly valued. He was a man who still believed in the unwavering truth of honest effort, even as he carried the quiet sorrow of past lessons learned too harshly. This blend of a stoic exterior and profound inner integrity was his essence, and it was this very strength, this deep-seated capacity for trust, that had once, long ago, proven to be his undoing. Every morning, the industrial hum of the city wasn't a symphony for Eugene. It was a prelude to the 5 a.m. alarm clock's insistent bleat. The sound, sharp and unforgiving, cut through the quiet of his small, well-maintained house on Elm Street. He'd swing his feet to the cool linoleum, a familiar shock that seemed to jolt his whole system into reluctant motion. Brenda, his wife of 26 years, usually stirred beside him, a soft rustle of sheets, but remained asleep, her presence a quiet anchor in the dim room. The ritual was rote. Coffee black as the pre-dawn sky, while the local news droned on about things that felt a million miles away. A quick shower, the steam briefly chasing away the chill that seemed to settle in his bones overnight. He'd checked the locks on the doors, even the ones he knew Brenda had already checked, a small, unconscious act born of a fear he rarely acknowledged. By 5:45, he was in his old pickup, the engine turning over with a familiar groan, heading for the gray industrial park where the new factory stood. This wasn't his factory, not in the way the old one had been. This was just a job, a steady paycheck. The machinery here was bigger, louder, more automated, but the work itself, for a man like Eugene, was still about precision and repetition. He ran a CNC machine, programming its intricate dance, feeding it raw material, watching it carve out identical parts, hour after monotonous hour. His hands, gnarled and powerful, still moved with an expert's grace, but the satisfaction had been replaced by a quiet sense of duty. Dinner was usually quiet, too. Brenda, a school secretary, would set a simple, wholesome meal on the table in their cozy kitchen. They'd talk about Sarah's latest update from college, or Mike's new job, their grown kids' bright spots that shone through the everyday grind. But beneath the surface of these ordinary conversations, a constant hum of worry persisted. The bills, always the bills. Property taxes, utilities, the car insurance, the lingering medical costs from Brenda's bout with the flu last winter. Eugene was a meticulous budgeter, every penny accounted for, but it felt like pushing a heavy boulder uphill, day after relentless day, just to stay in place. Their house, while loved and cared for, felt like a constant balancing act, one wrong step away from tumbling down. Sometimes, late at night, after Brenda had fallen asleep, Eugene would find himself in the quiet living room, the muted glow of the street lamp casting long shadows through the blinds. He'd sit there, hands clasped, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. He was a man who'd once dreamed of building something tangible, something that bore his mark, a business rooted in his values of honest craftsmanship and community. He remembered the thrill of designing the old workshop, the smell of fresh lumber, the camaraderie with his former partner, a man he'd loved like a brother. That was a time when the hum of machines had felt like music, a symphony of creation. Now those dreams felt like old photographs, faded and sepia-toned, tucked away in an attic he rarely visited. They weren't dead, not quite, but buried deep under layers of responsibility and a quiet, persistent sorrow. The man he was now, punching a clock, meticulously watching every penny, felt a world away from the hopeful, trusting man who'd poured his entire savings, his very soul, into that first venture. He carried the weight of it all. The memory of that betrayal, the sting of having been so wrong about someone he considered family, the shame of the financial ruin that had followed, even though it wasn't his fault. It was a wound that hadn't truly healed, just scarred over, leaving him forever wary, forever guarded. He'd rebuilt his life piece by painstaking piece, but the trust, that bedrock of his being, had shattered. It made him overly self-reliant now, unwilling to lean too heavily on anyone, even Brenda, for fear of burdening her, or worse, of being let down again. He was fiercely protective of what he had, precisely because he'd lost everything once before. And in those quiet, solitary hours, a chilling thought would sometimes creep in. Is this all there is now? This quiet struggle, this endless vigilance. He wasn't a man given to self-pity, but the question, cold and sharp, was a constant companion in the depths of his soul. He wanted to build an empire, even a small one, an honest one. Instead, he worked in someone else's, haunted by the ghost of his own. The ghost, see, it wasn't some wisp of smoke or a chill in the air. It was a man named Mark, as real as the wrench in Eugene's hand, as solid as the concrete floor beneath his boots. Mark had been family, practically. They'd built mid-state fabrication, together from two rusty welders and a dream sketched on a greasy napkin in the back of a diner. Eugene, the quiet workhorse, meticulous with the machines, steady with the numbers. Mark, the charmer, the salesman, the one who could talk a dog off a meat wagon. For 10 years, they'd been a pair, like cogs in a well-oiled machine, each knowing the other's rhythm. They'd laughed, cursed, sweated side by side. Eugene had trusted Mark with his life, with his future, with every dime he'd ever saved. He remembered the early days, the smell of freshly cut steel, the roar of the grinders, the pride of seeing their logo on a delivery truck. Sarah and Mike were little then, Brenda working part-time to help them make ends meet, always a hot meal on the table no matter how late Eugene got home. Life was hard, sure, but it was theirs. They were building something. He'd seen Mark put a down payment on a flashy new pickup, a boat even. Eugene, ever the pragmatic one, just nodded, figuring Mark deserved to enjoy the fruits of their labor. After all, he was the face of the business, bringing in the big contracts. Eugene was content to manage the shop, make sure the quality was top-notch, the margins tight. Then little things started to catch in his craw. A check from a major client, usually in the mail slot by the 10th, was late. Eugene asked Mark, "Oh, got it deposited directly, Gene? Streamlining things, you know?" Mark had flashed his easy grin, and Eugene, ever the loyal partner, had let it go. A few weeks later, a supplier called, agitated about an overdue invoice. "Overdue? We paid that last month," Eugene insisted, pulling up the digital ledger. He saw the entry, paid in full, but the supplier kept insisting. Mark had stepped in, smoothed it over, promised to look into a clerical error. He'd even bought the guys a round of beers that Friday, laughing about how sometimes the banks just screwed things up. Eugene had felt a flicker of unease, quickly doused by Mark's jovial nature and the clinking of glasses. The flicker became a steady flame one Tuesday morning. Eugene had come in early before anyone else to tackle a complex order. He needed a specific part number from a locked cabinet in Mark's office. Mark wasn't there, which wasn't unusual, but Eugene found the spare key he knew Mark kept hidden under a loose floorboard. Inside, on Mark's desk, half hidden beneath a stack of marketing flyers, was a bank statement. Not the business account statement, but a personal one, Mark's name. A balance that made Eugene's stomach drop like a faulty elevator. And a series of transfers, large ones, to an account Eugene didn't recognize. His hands shook as he scrolled through the online business accounts on Mark's computer, which Mark had conveniently left logged in. The clerical error with the supplier. That entry was real, but the money hadn't gone to the supplier. It had gone to a ghost account. Then from the ghost account to Mark's personal one. Thousands, tens of thousands, over months, years. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash of his entire life savings. Every late night, every skipped vacation, every penny he'd reinvested. It wasn't just the money. It was the trust, ripped open and splayed out for him to see. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled out of the office, the hum of the dormant machinery suddenly oppressive, mocking. The dream, the empire he and Mark were building, wasn't just a ghost now. It was a rotting corpse, hollowed out from the inside. Mark hadn't just siphoned funds. He drained the very lifeblood, leaving Eugene to preside over the skeletal remains of their shared ambition. He called Mark. No answer. Called Brenda, voice tight with a horror he couldn't yet articulate. "Something's wrong, honey. Something terrible." He didn't hear from Mark again. Just a curt email from a lawyer a few days later stating Mark had dissolved his partnership and abdicated all responsibilities, citing irreconcilable differences. The debt, the bankruptcy, the failure, all Eugene's. That night the house was a tomb. Brenda had cried herself to sleep beside him, her soft sobs having finally subsided into heavy breathing. He'd slipped out of bed, the sheets suddenly too confining, the air too thick. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a baleful 3:17 a.m. He was in the kitchen, the familiar quiet of his home a cruel mockery. Sarah and Mike, bless their innocent hearts, were sound asleep down the hall, oblivious to the earthquake that had just ripped through their parents' world. He poured himself a glass of water, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Each swallow was a struggle, as if his body was refusing to nourish itself in the face of such devastation. He walked to the back door, peered out into the inky blackness of the yard, the dim outlines of Brenda's prize-winning rose bushes barely visible. They looked just as desolate as he felt. How could he have been so stupid? The question hammered in his skull, relentless, unforgiving. All those years, all that trust, all that effort poured into a man who had proven to be nothing but a common thief. The shame was a bitter bile in his mouth. He wasn't just broke, he was a fool, a dupe. He'd let his family down, let himself down. The bankruptcy papers, already delivered by a grim-faced courier, sat on the counter, a stark white testament to his failure. They listed liabilities that stretched into the hundreds of thousands, a mountain of debt that felt insurmountable. He imagined the headlines, the whispers in the community, the pitying glances. Eugene, the honest man. How did he fall so far? His hands, calloused and strong from years of honest work, felt suddenly weak, useless. What had he saved? What had he built? Nothing but a house of cards, now scattered to the winds by the flick of a betrayer's wrist. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the images, Mark's smiling face, the gleaming new truck, the empty factory floor, the stack of bills. But they persisted, a tormenting slideshow of his ruined life. The rage, cold and hard, started to bubble up from somewhere deep inside him. Not just at Mark, but at himself for being so blind, so trusting. He was adrift, unmoored, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. Everything he had was gone or would be soon. His home, their savings, his reputation. He was staring into an abyss, and the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart, a drum against the silence of a life that had just collapsed. He was staring into an abyss, and the only sound was the frantic beating of his own heart, a drum against the silence of a life that had just collapsed. The first crack wasn't a thunderclap. It was more like the whisper of a hairline fracture in a sturdy beam. A missed payment notice tacked to the usual pile of junk mail had caught his eye, just a small one for a specialty component supplier. Eugene had shrugged it off, thinking Mark must have just overlooked it. Mark, his partner of 15 years, the man who'd stood as best man at his wedding, the godfather to his daughter Sarah. Overlooked it, that was all. But then came the phone call, sharp and demanding, from the bank. An overdraft larger than he'd ever seen, tied to the main business account. Impossible, he'd told the woman, his voice firm even as a chill started to creep up his spine. All our invoices are paid up, our receivables are solid. She'd been polite but unyielding. The money simply wasn't there. He tried Mark's cell, straight to voicemail, tried the office line, then his home number. Nothing. An odd prickle of unease had turned into a cold dread. He drove to the factory, the one they'd built from the ground up, brick by painstaking brick. The parking lot was empty. Mark's truck, usually there before anyone else's, was gone. The lights were off, not just off, but dark. A feeling of wrongness settled over him like a shroud. Inside, the silence was deafening. No hum of machinery, no distant clanking, just the hollow echo of his own footsteps. He walked to Mark's office, a knot tightening in his gut. The door was ajar. The desk was clean, too clean, not a single stray paper, not a coffee mug, not even the framed photo of Mark's kids. It was as if no one had ever worked there. Then he saw it. A small, almost imperceptible discoloration on the wall where a heavy safe used to be bolted. Now just 4 raw holes. The floor in front of it was scuffed where something heavy had been dragged. The air left Eugene's lungs in a silent gasp. He knelt, his hand running over the rough concrete. The safe had held their emergency fund, a buffer for lean times, their mutual nest egg for expansion. He'd signed off on a withdrawal slip just last month for a fictitious upgrade to a CNC machine. Mark had said it was a good time to get a deal, promised to handle the details. Eugene had barely glanced at the amount, trusting his friend implicitly. That amount. It was just a fraction of what they had in there. His fingers fumbled for the spare key to the main financial ledger, usually kept in a locked drawer. Empty. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up his throat. He went to the main computer, logged in. The financial software, usually so transparent, now showed a bewildering series of transfers, shell companies, and phantom invoices. One particular entry stood out, a substantial sum wired to an offshore account, dated just 2 weeks ago. And the signatory on every last one of them. Mark's name. A clear, undeniable signature. The world tilted. He saw a flash of Mark's smile, heard his easy laugh, remembered the countless evenings spent planning their future over lukewarm beer. All of it a lie. Every shared dream, every handshake, every comforting word. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was a dagger plunged into the very heart of his trust, twisting it until it was nothing but shredded tissue. This wasn't just Mark leaving. This was Mark taking everything with him, leaving Eugene to face the ruins. The bankruptcy papers on the counter now made horrifying sense. They weren't a random act of fate. They were the inevitable, meticulously orchestrated consequence of a calculated, cruel deception. And Eugene, the honest man, the trusting man, was left holding the bag. The house was a tomb. Brenda, bless her heart, had tried to talk, tried to understand, but his words were choked in his throat. He'd simply shaken his head, motioned to the kids to give them space, and retreated. Now it was 3 a.m., and he was alone in the quiet darkness of the living room, the world outside hushed, mocking him with its peaceful indifference. He sat upright on the sofa, fully dressed, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His mind was a vicious hamster wheel, each rotation bringing fresh torment. The shame burned hotter than ever. Not just the public shame, the community knowing he'd failed, but the private, searing shame of being so utterly blind. How could he have been so stupid, so naive? He'd seen himself as shrewd, observant. Now he saw himself as a fool, an easy mark. The image of Mark, laughing as he signed those fraudulent transfers, played on an endless loop. Brenda's soft breathing from the bedroom down the hall was a constant reminder of what he stood to lose. His family, his safe harbor. How could he tell her they might lose everything? The house, the future they'd planned. He saw Sarah's bright, optimistic face, Mike's quiet determination. He was supposed to be their rock, their foundation. Instead, he was crumbling. A heavy knot of despair settled in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He pushed himself off the couch, walked to the window, and stared out at the sleeping street. Every house represented a life, a dream, a struggle. His own life, once seemingly solid, had fractured into a million pieces. He was a factory worker, yes, but he was also a man who had built something, nurtured it, watched it grow. And now it was gone, reduced to numbers on a bankruptcy form. What was he now? Just a man with calloused hands and an empty bank account. A man who had failed. The weight of it was suffocating. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to smash something. But there was nothing to hit, no one to blame but the ghost of his own misplaced trust. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the dampness around his eyes. He wasn't crying. The sorrow was too deep for tears. It was a barren, empty ache, a silent scream trapped in his soul. He had built his world on integrity, on hard work, on faith in others, and every pillar had been kicked out from under him. What was left? Absolutely nothing. His own reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, a stranger with haunted eyes. He didn't recognize the despair etched into that face. It wasn't Eugene. Not the Eugene who fixed leaky faucets at Brenda's sister's house. Not the Eugene who helped Mike rebuild his first car engine. Not the Eugene who could spot a faulty weld from across the factory floor. That Eugene had a purpose, a plan, a fight in him. This one was hollowed out. He stood there for what felt like hours, the only sound the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the living room. Each tick a second stolen, a second closer to an unavoidable truth. He was broke. Betrayed. He was, by all accounts, finished. The thought settled in his gut like a cold, hard stone. Finished. Then something shifted. Not a grand revelation, not a bolt of lightning, but a slow, almost imperceptible hardening around the edges of that cold stone. An ember deep down stirred. Finished. No, not yet. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, strong. They had built things, fixed things, provided. They weren't finished. His mind, though tired, still worked. His word, though tarnished by another man's deceit, was still his own. And his breath, though heavy, still filled his lungs. "Enough," he whispered into the silent room. The word hung there, small but resolute. Enough of the self-pity. Enough of the shame. Enough of letting another man's poison rot him from the inside out. He still didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or even how he was supposed to face it. He had no plan, no grand strategy to rebuild from the ashes. All he knew was that he refused to lie down and die. He refused to let Frank's greed be the final chapter of his story. The first sliver of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, seeping through the edges of the curtains. Brenda stirred as he quietly slid back into bed. She mumbled something, half asleep, and snuggled closer. Her warmth, her trust, was a fragile comfort, but also a fierce reminder of why he couldn't break. He lay there, eyes wide open, waiting for the alarm. Barely slept, but a strange, brittle energy had taken root. When the clock screamed at 5:00 a.m., it felt different. Not a summons to another day of monotonous work, but a call to arms. He swung his legs out of bed, the familiar ache in his back a dull throb rather than a crushing weight. He walked to the bathroom, looked at his haggard face in the mirror, and for the first time in days, he didn't flinch away. He made his coffee, the bitter aroma filling the small kitchen. Brenda was still asleep. He scribbled a note. "Coffee's made. Don't worry. Love you." He hesitated, then crumpled it up and wrote another. "Coffee's made. I'll be back late. Don't worry. Love you." He needed to be out to do something, even if he didn't know what it was yet. The old Ford pickup rumbled to life with a cough and a sputter, the sound familiar and grounding. He drove aimlessly at first, past the diner, past the hardware store, past the park where he used to take the kids. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white. The urge to turn around, to go back to bed, to simply disappear was a powerful current pulling at him. The sheer enormity of what he faced threatened to drown him again. But then he found himself turning down the street that led to the old factory. The chain-link fence, the faded sign with his and Frank's names, the empty parking lot. It was a ghost, his ghost. He parked across the street and just stared. The building was quiet dead, a symbol of his ruin, For a long minute, he considered driving away. Let it rot. Let the bank take it. Let Frank get away with it. But then he saw the faint outline of the M in manufacturing on the sign, still stubbornly clinging to the peeling paint. It was a small thing, a stupid thing, but it triggered something in him. He hadn't just worked here, he'd poured his soul into every bolt, every weld, every machine. He knew every creak of that building, every hum of its presses. He cut the engine. The silence was deafening. He reached into his glove box, pulled out an old, worn notepad and a stubby pencil. His stomach churned with a mixture of dread and a faint, unfamiliar spark. He didn't know how to start an empire, but he knew how to take inventory. He knew how to assess damage. He knew how to look at the wreckage and figure out what, if anything, could be salvaged. It was day one, and all he had was a broken factory and a stubborn refusal to quit. He walked across the street, the gravel crunching under his boots, each step echoing the emptiness inside the factory walls. The padlock on the main door was gone, probably picked clean by Frank's last visit. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded like the building itself was in pain. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stale scent of abandonment. Sheets of plastic, ripped and torn, hung from the ceilings. Boxes were overturned, their contents spilled across the concrete floor. It was a war zone, a battlefield where he had been utterly rooted. Frank hadn't just taken the money, he'd left a mess, a final, spiteful middle finger. Eugene walked past the silent machines, each one coated in a fine layer of grime like dormant beasts. He ran a hand over the cold steel of the big hydraulic press, the one he'd saved for years to buy. It felt alien, lifeless. He went to his old office, a small cubicle by the loading bay. The desk was bare, the drawers pulled out and empty. Even his coffee mug was gone. He sank into his worn office chair, its springs protesting, and stared at the chaos. A wave of nausea washed over him. He closed his eyes, leaning back, and for a long minute he felt the familiar pull of despair, the voice whispering, "Just walk away, Eugene. It's over." But then he opened his eyes, and he saw a small, forgotten wrench lying under a shelf. A simple, ordinary wrench. He picked it up, feeling the solid weight in his palm. It was real, tangible. He couldn't fix everything, not today, not tomorrow. But he could pick up this wrench. He could start. He spent the rest of that first day and the next doing nothing but cleaning. He swept. He dusted. He righted overturned boxes, sorting through what was trash and what was salvageable. He didn't think about the debt, didn't think about Frank, didn't think about the impossible mountain ahead. He just focused on the rhythmic scrape of the broom, the satisfying wipe of a rag over a grimy surface. It was mindless work, but it was work, and for the first time in months, he felt a faint echo of purpose. He found a broken-down forklift, its tires flat, and spent hours just taking it apart, cleaning each component, figuring out what was busted. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with a familiar efficiency. By the third day, the sheer scale of the task began to crush him again. He discovered more missing parts, more evidence of Frank's slow, deliberate looting. A critical piece of the main stamping machine, essential for production, was gone. Just gone. The kind of part you couldn't just order from Amazon. It would have to be custom fabricated, and that meant time and money he didn't have. He sat on the floor in front of the gaping maw of the machine, the missing part a void that mirrored the one in his gut. He slammed his fist against the concrete floor, a raw, frustrated grunt escaping his lips. "Damn you, Frank." He muttered, his voice hoarse. "Damn you to hell." That night he barely slept. The anger had a cold edge to it now, a sharp clarity. He knew he was being foolish, that he should cut his losses, declare bankruptcy. Brenda had brought him lunch to the factory that day, her eyes full of concern, not saying much but just watching him work. He saw the worry lines around her mouth, and it twisted something inside him. He was dragging her through this hell too. Day 7 brought an old friend. Exhaustion, not just physical, though his muscles ached constantly, but a deep, bone-weary mental fatigue. He'd fixed the forklift, replaced its tires from a spare set he'd found tucked away, and got it running. A small victory. But then he tried to power up the main electrical panel. Nothing. Dead. Frank must have stripped some key wiring, or maybe the bank had already cut the power. He spent hours tracing lines, checking breakers, his head pounding. He wanted to scream. He wanted to sit down and cry. He wanted to curl up and disappear. He almost did. He packed his tools, threw them into the back of his truck, and drove out of the empty parking lot, a feeling of utter defeat settling over him like a shroud. He drove for miles, aimlessly, past the old diner, past the park where he used to take the kids. The thought of going home, of facing Brenda with another failure in his eyes, felt unbearable. He considered just driving until the gas ran out. Just ending it all in some quiet, forgotten roadside motel. But then he saw a roadside billboard for a new housing development, shiny and clean. And he remembered Sarah and Mike, their faces, their laughter, the way they looked up to him. He remembered the shame in his own father's eyes when he lost his job in the 80s, the way it had broken him. Eugene had sworn he'd never let that happen to his kids. He might be broken, but he wouldn't be broken. Not like that. He clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking. He pulled off the highway at the next exit, drove into a dingy hardware store and bought a multimeter and a thick book on industrial electrical systems. He didn't know a damn thing about rewiring a whole factory, but he knew how to read a diagram. He knew how to learn. He drove back to the factory, the sky darkening. The anger was still there, but now it was a cold, hard fuel. He wasn't giving up. He could. He refused to. Not yet. He had his hands, he had his brain, and he still had his word. He just had to figure out how to put them back to use. He drove back, the anger a cold knot in his gut, but beneath it, a sliver of something else, a refusal to break. The factory loomed, a hollow shell under the dim streetlights, but this time it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a challenge. He pulled out the multimeter and the thick book, flipping to the first chapter on electrical theory, the words blurring in his tired eyes. He didn't stop until dawn, fueled by lukewarm coffee and stubbornness, mapping out the old wiring diagrams, tracing conduits that had been there since the building went up. The next few weeks bled into a haze of sweat, dust, and the acrid smell of ozone from miswired circuits. He lived at the factory, sleeping on a cot in the office, Brenda bringing him meals wrapped in foil, her silent support a heavier weight than any accusation. He learned about power distribution, about PLC programming, about the tensile strength of different metals, about the intricate dance of gears and belts. His hands, already calloused, grew tougher, marked by cuts and burns. His hair, already thinning, receded a bit more, and new lines etched themselves around his eyes. He talked to nobody, save for a gruff nod to Brenda when she dropped off a plate of meatloaf. He was a man possessed, driven not by hope, but by the sheer, bloody-minded refusal to surrender. He failed more times than he succeeded. A circuit board fried, a motor he thought he'd fixed sputtered and died, a crucial part he'd salvaged turned out to be useless. There were nights he'd throw a wrench across the floor, the clang echoing in the cavernous space, and stare at the ceiling, wondering if he was completely insane. He'd think of Michael, his former partner, probably sunning himself on some beach, living it up with Eugene's life savings. The thought would burn a toxic fuel, and he'd pick up the damn wrench again, his jaw set, and go back to work. Then, around the third week, something shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible. He was hunched over an old lathe, its motor seized, stripped bare of useful parts. He'd spent 2 days trying to re-engineer a new drive shaft from scrap metal, welding it by hand, grinding it down. He flicked the power switch, holding his breath, expecting the usual dead silence or the groan of a dying engine. Instead, with a low, steady hum, the motor spun to life. It wasn't perfect, rattled a bit, but it worked. He stood there for a long moment, the hum a symphony in the quiet factory, a faint, almost forgotten feeling stirring in his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was more like a loosening, a crack in the concrete wall he'd built around himself. He found himself, later that week, whistling an old tune Brenda used to hum, something he hadn't done in years. Brenda noticed. She saw the tired lines around his eyes were still there, but now there was a different kind of light in them, less despair, more determination. He still didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't as heavy. He started sleeping more soundly, the 3 a.m. terrors less frequent. He began to see the factory not as a monument to his failure, but as a blank canvas. Weeks turned into months. Eugene was still Eugene, the man of few words, the quiet observer, but the rough edges of his grief had been honed into something sharper, harder. He'd become a meticulous planner. The margins of his electrical book now covered in precise flowcharts and detailed schematics for a completely new layout. He spent hours on the phone, not begging but negotiating, his voice calm, steady, and unyielding. Suppliers who'd written him off found themselves listening to his proposals, drawn in by his raw honesty and the sheer conviction in his voice. He'd learned to talk numbers like a shark, every decimal point accounted for, every contingency planned. The trusting man was gone, replaced by someone who weighed every word, every handshake. He salvaged what he could, sold what he couldn't use, and used every penny to buy quality, not cheap alternatives. He wasn't just fixing the old factory. He was reimagining it from the ground up, designing a workflow that was efficient, safe, and crucially built on redundancy. No single point of failure, no single point of trust. He hired back a few of his old crew, men who had stood by him, their faces etched with relief and a renewed sense of purpose. He told them straight up how it was going to be. No more silent partners, no more hidden accounts. This time, every employee would have a stake, a piece of the action, a voice in how things were run. He watched their faces, seeing not just the old loyalty, but a new, cautious hope reflected back at him. His movements were still precise, economical, but now they carried the weight of confidence. He walked through the partially rebuilt plant, not with the haunted gaze of a man burying his past, but with the focused vision of an architect laying the foundation for his future. He wasn't just a factory worker anymore. He was a builder, a leader, a man who had faced the abyss and found a way to forge a new path with nothing but his own 2 hands and an unbreakable will. The lines on his face were deeper, but they weren't lines of defeat. They were lines of experience, of resilience. He knew deep down that he was building something stronger, something real this time. The weeks melted into months, each day a testament to grit and sweat. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the familiar tang of hot metal and industrial lubricant. But there was a new scent too, the subtle fragrance of purpose, of shared endeavor. Eugene's new structure, the one where every hand on the floor had a voice, began to take root. Early on, a glitch in the new automated assembly line threatened to halt production. The old Eugene might have retreated to his office, driven himself ragged trying to solve it alone. But this Eugene gathered his crew. "All right, fellas," he'd said, gesturing to the malfunctioning arm. "This ain't just my problem anymore. This is ours. Ideas." Silence for a beat, then Old Man Johnson, a grizzled welder who'd been with Eugene since the beginning, cleared his throat. "Boss, if we reroute that pressure valve, might give it the play it needs." Eugene listened, then walked over, not to correct, but to inspect with Johnson. They tinkered, they argued, they laughed quietly at a few false starts. By the end of the day, the line was running smoother than it ever had. It wasn't just a fix, it was a bond forged. Brenda saw the change first, subtle as a whisper at dawn. He still woke before the sun, but the deep-set lines around his eyes seemed to have softened, the weariness replaced by a quiet intensity. He talked more, not about the endless grind of work, but about possibilities. About an idea for a new product line, about a suggestion one of the younger guys had made for streamlining their waste disposal. He spoke with a fervor he hadn't possessed in years, a quiet pride that didn't quite reach boastfulness. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the cicadas chirping their nightly song, she watched him, really watched him. "You're different, Eugene," she said, her voice soft. He grunted, looking out at the street. "Just older, I suppose." "No," she insisted, "not just older. You got a shine in your eye again, like you did when we first built the old place." He took a slow breath, the air thick with summer. "Maybe," he admitted almost to himself, "maybe I finally learned how to build it right." The Phoenix Forge, as the new plant was unofficially dubbed by the local newspaper, began to hum with a different kind of energy. It wasn't just a factory. It was a living, breathing organism, fueled by shared ownership and mutual respect. Eugene still walked the floor, his eyes missing nothing, but now he was less a taskmaster and more a conductor, orchestrating the symphony of steel and human ingenuity. He still worked the longest hours, still got his hands dirty, but the burden was no longer solely his. When the quarterly numbers came in, stronger than anyone had dared hope, he didn't just pocket the profits. He stood before his crew, laid out the figures, and announced the employee dividend. Faces lit up, a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. These weren't just jobs, they were futures. His kids, Sarah and Mike, saw it too. When they came home for Sunday dinner, the house wasn't thick with the unspoken tension that had hung in the air for so long. Eugene still had that stoic quality, that quiet strength, but there was an openness there now, a willingness to listen, to share without the constant undercurrent of unspoken worry. Mike, who had always been a little more reserved, asked him one day, "Dad, how'd you do it? How'd you come back from all that?" Eugene leaned back in his chair, a half-smile playing on his lips. He looked at his son, then at Sarah, then out the window at the garden Brenda tended so meticulously. "You lose a lot of things in life, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Some of it gets stolen, some of it just blows away with the wind. But the one thing they can't take, the one thing that sticks with you through thick and thin, that's your own 2 hands and your word. And if you got those 2 things, really got them, then you still got a future. Maybe not the one you planned, but a future just the same." He paused, a distant look in his eyes, remembering the cold loneliness of that dark night. "Just gotta learn who to trust," he added almost as an afterthought, the faintest hint of old pain flickering in his gaze. "And sometimes, for a while, that's nobody but yourself. And that's the thing about men like Eugene. Some get knocked down and stay down, buried under the weight of betrayal and bad luck. Others, though, they find a way to stand back up, wipe the dust off their knees, and build something new, something real, something strong.